Well, a warm welcome this evening to in the series of an examination of Victorian painting. And tonight I'm looking at the subject of Victorian social realism. And I know a number of you have a great deal of knowledge about the Victorian era and some of the circumstances that prompt some of these paintings. So I'm looking at it from an artist's point of view and what constitutes social realism in Victorian art. And we've got some exciting paintings. Somebody said to me that they found them rather depressing, and I can certainly understand that. Some of the subjects are painful subjects, so certainly it's not like looking at some of the aesthetic works of Burne-Jones or Rossetti. We're looking at another side of Victorian visual art and expression. So Victorian social realism, we'll just define the terms really because it straddles a number of areas in painting really. It's really a development of genre painting developed from Dutch 17th century painting, really, on a human subject matter and anecdote. It does, to some extent, link in with historical painting, which remember was at the top of the pack so far as Joshua Reynolds was concerned and the Royal Academy. Uh, Above all, in Victorian England, it is a literary form of painting. So many of the paintings relate to passages from literature, particularly the work of Charles Dickens and Thackeray. And there is a strong link between popular illustration and illustrators who illustrated in magazines in Victorian England, particularly the graphic, and we shall be looking at that. There's an element of propaganda in some of these Victorian paintings, and there is plenty of classical and biblical allusion. And indeed, I'm going to show some paintings that don't appear social realist at all, but in fact are about social awareness and social situations that came to the fore in the mid-Victorian era. A lot of the paintings are exemplified by rejection of romantic ideals within painting. So paintings do not necessarily are not pretty or not. They deal with subjects as they are, and there's a strong emphasis upon Christian morality within these works. They depict everyday people and working people, and they reflect this new emphasis in Victorian England on the emerging working classes, particularly those within the expanding cities. Charles Dickens said, there are dark shadows on the earth, but its lights are stronger in the contrast. And Dickens will be with us throughout this talk, and we'll see things that are very much linked with Dickens' novels and his writings. So we go back really to the 18th century and see the paintings of Joseph Wright of Derby, one of the great artists who depicted the emerging Industrial Revolution. And his Iron Forge from 1772 is a very good example of Joseph Wright of Derby's work, giving us an insight into the new iron smelting and at Dale, and his paintings are extraordinary paintings and a wonderful achievement. And in fact, there is a link with these paintings and some of the Victorians that I'm going to show you. But certainly the paintings here show the early years of the Industrial Revolution and an excitement about the new engineering principles and science in particular. But if we go to the right-hand pane, which is Gustave Doré's London Pilgrimage illustration, that is exactly 100 years after Joseph Wright of Derby's painting. And we see in this wonderful illustration by Doré, who came to England, like many a French artist in the early 1870s, taking refuge in Britain. And he began this series of illustrations called London, a Pilgrimage. And he depicts really the squalor and the filth and what had happened with these rapidly growing cities. And I think there's no better illustration than this particular one on the right, to show the smoke and the degradation of these close, small new houses that had already become sort of encased in soot and grime. And so it well sums up what it was, the city life was like in this particular time. And we'll be seeing some of Doré's illustrations. But artists have always had an interest in depicting the poor, particularly the rural poor. And if we think back to the 18th century, the great Thomas Gainsborough painted a number of fancy pictures which were to evoke a certain sympathy for the poor, particularly the rural poor. This one, The Cottage Girl from 1785, similar period to Joseph Wright of Derby's painting, comes from this great period, this golden age of British art. And there are many such pictures. Indeed, this one of Girl with Pigs is another one which Joshua Reynolds highly praised. His great rival in this particular painting. But these paintings are really about evoking sympathy, and they have a sentimental quality, as wonderful as they are. And you could say that someone like Frank Holl, who we should be looking at today, again in his paintings in the 1870s of the rural poor, this one of Winter, which is on the bottom pane of the slide here, is again in the spirit, in a sense, of the Gainsborough, as is the Millet of the Mistletoe Gatherer. There is a certain sentimentality about these particular paintings, but there is also a new realism in depicting certainly the dress and the circumstances of the hard life, particularly of young women working in difficult circumstances. At the beginning of the 19th century, an artist from Fife, a Scottish artist who became a very prominent artist in the early 19th century, came down to the Royal Academy and was a good friend of J.M.W. Turner, is David Wilkie. And his painting, The Blind Fiddler, is a painting that had an enormous reach and influence. And it is, in one sense, it's very similar to a Dutch 17th century painting of a cottage or a bothy interior, but it also shows this emerging fascination with working people and expressing the lives of a poor family. And indeed, it looks at this blind fiddler and the entertainment. And there is, within paintings like this, quite a great deal of realistic observation. And this is something that develops, as we will see, by the time of the reign of Queen Victoria. It is taken up in a number of different ways. But there is no stock style. Certainly, Wilkie's work was highly celebrated, and this is probably his greatest piece. And it was an age of great change, as we know, and a number of other talks have touched upon this. It's the age of the Chimney Sweeps Act, the Mine and Collieries Act, the Factory Acts, the Coal Mining Acts, and regulations of factory and workshops. It is also the period of the Education Act in 1870, which made it law for both for children, both female and male, to receive an elementary education. I have a painting here by Thomas George Webster of a dame school, which prefigures that. Very often prominent in these paintings of schoolrooms or dame schools. You will be able, if one were to zoom in on some of these paintings, you can see quite often there is something like a cane on the wall or something like that. There's lots of these Dickensian sort of insights into some of the harsher side of the schoolroom. And we think of Mr. Wackford Squeers from Nicholas Nickleby, and there's an illustration of him above us there. And again, we are reminded that of the social evils of the early Victorian era with young people working in mines and in very difficult circumstances. And there's also we've looked at this before, Cruikshank's cartoon reworking of the British beehive and the very strict social strata that artists started to engage with. If we look in the late 18th century, we look at Sir William Beech's portrait of Sir Francis Ford's children giving a coin to a beggar boy. We see an 18th century attitude to parish relief and the poor. But if we look at Millet's painting, The Woodman's Daughter from 1850-51, the social divisions are subtly alluded to using the Coventry Patmore poem of the young squire passing some strawberries out to the woodman's daughter. And of course, the painting is primarily about the tragedy and of the unfolding in Patmore's poem, and about the inequality between the squire and the young girl who later becomes pregnant, and the child drowns. And it's a tragic tale. It's backed up by literature, and so that is a pre-Raphaelite engagement with a social situation, obviously set back in time, but it's certainly a development from the painting that we get by Beechy, which is in the Tate Gallery, and it's the period too of Gladstone as well, and also of some absolutely horrific situations which were illustrated by artists. Remember, we didn't have necessarily photo reportage as we have today, but artists tried to actually illustrate some of these awful events, and particularly Oak's colliery explosion, which happened in 1866, which killed 361 people, injuring many more. The explosion at the colliery in Barnsley, and as it was pointed, things like this provoked a great deal of interest, and also examination of how one managed both these industrial situations, the mines, the mills, at the time, and it brought in new acts to restrict and to manage these quite horrific situations. And artists depicted these things, and we see, particularly in Illustrated London News and in the Graphic, we see illustrations to some of these social evils, and some fine artists actually started to draw such things. And Gladstone said, "Selfishness is the greatest curse of the human race." And of course, we see the beginnings of activism too against some of the mill owners who. And we come to the personal also, rather like the Millet painting of the woodman's daughter. We also come to another hero of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who was William Hogarth, who in the 18th century had commented upon again social situations, particularly his Marriage a la Mode and the Harlot's Progress, particular social commentaries, and the pre-Raphaelites took up the baton really in the 1850s. There we have a picture on the left, The Awakening Conscience, which depicts a kept woman, and in a rather vulgar setting, and underneath the table a cat entraps a bird. Many things within this painting emphasize the predicament this young woman finds herself in, but it's a moment of realization as the sunlight crosses the carpet floor, that she has come to a realization that there is a way out of this difficult world that she finds herself in. And there was a lot, and of course Holman Hunt's work is highly symbolic, and he down to the engraving which is upon the wall above the piano of Mary Magdalene. And one of the great artists who I've given talks about is G.F. Watts. And some of his paintings in the 1850s, late 1840s and 1850s were powerful comments and critiques upon society. So his painting Under a Dry Arch was partly inspired by Thomas Hood's The Bridge of Sighs, and Hood's poem was exceptionally influential on a number of artists. Millet did an illustration in the late 1850s of The Bridge of Sighs. And we also get illustrations by Cruikshank to the drunkard's children, and it shows the plight of the abandoned woman or the streetwalker as well. And this is a big theme within this period of Victorian painting. If we go to the Foundling Museum in London, we see this painting here, Henry Nelson O'Neill's painting of a mother depositing her child. As you can see in a little slot in the wall, the child would be passed over to the Foundling Hospital. Possibly there would be a token, which might be, if better circumstances arose later, where the child might be retrieved, but that didn't very often happen. And such were the plight of young women coming to the city, very often from the countryside, to a life that had led them to a great deal of difficulty, and indeed, in some cases, to street walking. Frank Hull, in his Deserted, a Foundling from 1874, continues the theme. And there we can see the bobbies there on the side, taking a child which has been abandoned beside the river. And then, of course, in G.F. Watts's Found Drowned was directly inspired by Thomas Hood's poem The Bridge of Sighs, and it's a powerful painting. Very, very strong forms in these particular paintings by Watts, but different to his classical works. But he ennobles the working poor in a way that he does with his classical figures. And there's always a social commentary within Watts's work, however thinly disguised. And of course, even a pre-Raphaelite Rossetti approaches the subject of the fallen woman. And this is a drover coming into London to find his childhood sweetheart is now a streetwalker. And that is emphasized by the cart in the background and the bound lamb under the net. This is a painting that caused Rossetti a great deal of trouble painting. It actually depicts his own lover, Fanny Cornforth. But he wasn't alone at this time in doing this subject. There were many artists, particularly Richard Redgrave here, depicting the outcast, that is, a woman being driven from the marital home due to her infidelity. And it always seems to be the woman who is driven out and had no rights. And it follows William Hogarth's The Harlot's Progress in many respects. And my talk last month was on Spencer Stanhope's Thoughts of the Past, which likewise features a woman who has fallen into prostitution in the city. And as she gazes out the window, rather similar to the woman in The Awakening Conscience, she is in a moment of reverie, beginning to realize her situation. But there's no resolution necessarily in the Stanhope painting. We don't necessarily see a shaft of sunlight that necessarily means that she'll break free of this life that she has come into. And Leopold Egg, who acknowledged the Pre-Raphaelites, but was never actually a Pre-Raphaelite himself. And he did this trilogy, Past and Present, which on the right-hand side we have the woman's adultery has been discovered in the marital home. She is forced to leave the home, and there she gives birth to a baby, and there we can see them under the arch by the River Thames. And like so many Victorian paintings, Egg illustrates the plight with the posters, which seem to give more information, and above the woman's head is the word victims. And so we are led to see the desperation of this young woman, and yet she looks upon the illumination of the moon, and perhaps there is some hope that things may turn round eventually. And this painting, you wouldn't think has anything to do with social realism, and yet it does. It was bought by the Royal Holloway College, and it's really makes a comment. Long's painting makes a comment on the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, and no longer were women all a woman owned part of the part of the man's property. A woman could have her own property. It seems absurd now, but this was not the case. And so this Babylonian marriage market was really a comment upon that, and also a comment upon the debutantes of Victorian England. And this painting hangs in the Royal Holloway College, and so it has a particular social meaning, and it was well understood by the Holloway family, and it can be seen in the Royal Holloway Picture Gallery, which is a marvelous gallery of high Victorian art. This painting by Watts is another one from the early 1850s, and of course it depicts something which was one of the great issues of the late 1840s and early 1850s, and that was the potato famine in Ireland, and the desperate times that so many went through with the potato blight and the failure of the crops, and starvation ensued. And artists engage with this subject. Watts has a very powerful image of this desperate family, and the man's look towards us is almost accusatory. And then we have Daniel MacDonald's painting of an Irish peasant family discovering the blight of their store, which means that they will have no seed potatoes and they will also have no food. And we see the desperation within this particular painting. The Walter Howell Deverell, an associate of Rossetti and Millet, a pre-Raphaelite painter who sadly died very young, also depicts the Irish vagrants. As a result of the potato famine, so many made either left Ireland altogether, and so this was a suitable subject for painting and social commentary. And it continued, of course, through the late 1850s and right through the 1870s, 1880s, when the actual famine had subsided. But there's still this great wave of Irish emigration, and it is thought that over a quarter of the Irish population emigrated between that 20 years from the famine time. And Frank Hull, in his painting Gone, depicts the breadwinner going away on the train and to the docks, and probably sailing to North America for a new life. And so Hull depicts a very real social situation, and his paintings are powerful in this respect. Hull was an illustrator, so we'll find many of these social realists were all already illustrators as well, and that is why their works have such sort of acute power. William Bell Scott's Iron and Coal is one of the great paintings, rather like Ford Madox Brown's work, that depicts industry in the mid 1850s. And you can see South Shields in the background, and you can see everything going on, the making, the smelting of iron, and you can see the diagrams for the steam engine in the front of the picture. And in the background we observe obviously the foreman in the courtyard down below, and we see the ships that are loading up in the background. And of course, paintings such as this make a comment upon work, and worthy work it is too. Something that the young William Morris became increasingly fascinated with, but also railed against, and saw the great evils of some of the industrial processes. But here it's almost a heroic form of work, and indeed the paintings are similar to some of the 20th century social realist paintings. This particular one, which is in Northumberland. And here is the famous painting Work, which on the right depicts Maurice and Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle, the great philosopher writer of the Victorian era, and his commentary in Past and Present, particularly is cited in this painting, which took for Madox Brown almost 7 or 8 years to paint. There are two versions of it, and it depicts all orders of society in here in Hampstead, and the navvies are digging a sewer, and it is there is much within it as within Holman Hunt's painting that is symbolic, but it's also acutely observed as well. So we have gypsies, we have ragamuffins in the foreground, but we also have, rather like William Bell Scott, we have almost classical poses for the heroic workers in the street. And then behind it, we have the upper class people coming down this street, the High Street in Hampstead. And in the background, to the left of Thomas Carlyle, we have some posters for a local election that is about to take place. So there's a whole story going on here, and there's much to unpack in this particular painting. And artists also were depicting new situations that were occurring as a result of the new and enlarged city urban environment, and particularly William Egley and his London Omnibus of 1859. Egley was the son of a famous miniaturist painter, and he takes some of his father's skill in this almost pre-Raphaelite work, looking into the interior of a London omnibus. And it's a subject that occurs again in William Morgan's painting some years later, almost 30 years later, a picture of one of the people, Gladstone, in an omnibus. And it's certainly, these are very typical paintings of that would be shown at the Royal Academy. And what is new about these paintings is that there is a mixture of social classes thrown together through the new public transport. And there's also the great painting by Luke Fildes of the Doctor in 1891, which I've talked about before, which was commissioned by Henry Tate and the new Tate Gallery. And here it not only is it realistic, and it celebrates medicine and a scientific approach to healing, but it also depicts social concern too, because the worried father is not just worried for his child, but also worried about the cost that this visitation by the doctor will be. But like most Victorian paintings, it's almost like a movie. It includes, we believe that the dawn is coming, and the dawn's light is coming through the window, and it is that the child's fever will pass. And it is seen as the doctor is seen as a benevolent and a kindly figure, almost a Christ-like figure watching over the child. And this emphasised of Christian morality is a very important part of Victorian social realist painting. For this painting, Luke Fildes actually had a room constructed to actually make his observations more real in many ways. And it's his favourite sort of browns and blacks and rather drab colours, but very similar to some of the social realist works of Courbet in France too, that they're boldly painted and on a larger scale, obviously, than the pre-Raphaelite paintings that I have shown you. But here is a pre-Raphaelite painting, and this panel deals with disability, and in particular here there's the blind girl. And we can see it's a magnificent interpretation of the plight of a blind girl with her sister or her companion leading her through the world, which she can't see, but she can sense certain aspects of it, the sunlight, she can feel the harebells in her hand, and of course she plays music, and so she is not denied those senses too. And it, of course, again, it emphasizes a biblical view of the world. The rainbows are obviously, the rainbow is obviously symbolic of Noah's rainbow and the Noah's covenant following the great flood. But Tissot, who comes to London in 1870, who I've often talked about, a French artist, here he depicts the warrior's daughter, and the painting seems to be all about this young woman who comes along, not so much about the man wheeling her father along, but we certainly see in Victorian painting of the mid period of the Victorian painting more and more pictures which depict people with compromise, either with have lost a leg or an arm, or on crutches. This is beginning to become something we see in painting. And obviously we've got some Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim down at the bottom right hand corner there, and Nellie with her crutches above. But we have a lot of this, and of course we have many a war hero in Victorian England, many a Greenwich pensioner, and these are subjects that were frequently depicted. Here we have Millais with the Greenwich pensioners at the tomb of Nelson. These men in the very twilight of their life. You can see the snuff candle on the chair there, depicting that age was soon passing and is almost gone. And again, in the Chelsea Hospital, the last muster, we see the old pensioners there in Chelsea Hospital Chapel. And then Hercoma visits it again in the Old Guards Cheer in 1898. Obviously, people from the later campaigns in Afghanistan and India. But we have these artists depicting old age and heroism, and this is a very distinct strain within Victorian painting. But we also have those depicting some of the hardest jobs as well. Landseer approached in his stonebreaker and his daughter in the 1830s. Being a stonebreaker in the 19th century was one of the lowliest forms of occupation and one of the hardest. And here we have, in John Brett's painting of 1856, an exceptionally finely rendered painting of a young man breaking up pieces of flint to make a road. Those of you who know England will know that the background is Box Hill near Guildford. But obviously the young chap is too much engaged in his job to notice the beauty of nature all around him. And it was highly praised by Ruskin, was this painting, for its veracity. But it also, there's a sort of pathos about it too, that someone should work in this way and have a task like this, which is so crushing of the spirit. And of course, there is the famous Henry Wallace painting of the dead stonebreaker as well, which I'm not going to show here. And we know in France, Courbet did a very well known image of a stonebreaker. So a frequent image in Victorian painting and arousing social concern, as did William Thomas Stead's, the journalist and reformer, railing against Victorian child prostitution and trafficking. And this was a difficult subject to approach as an artist for obvious reasons. But an artist like G.F. Watts and Gustave Doré and many a Victorian artist approached this either in the guise of Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, or, as in G.F. Watts' painting The Minotaur of 1885, with this bestial figure crushing a bird in his hand, he is making a comment upon this this great ill in society. And it is about the maiden tribute of the modern Babylon. And it was published in the Pall Mall Gazette, and it had a great influence upon G.F. Watts, who painted this painting, The Minotaur. So it's not purely about the classical Minotaur, but it is about the evils that many children were subject to, particularly within the city. And if we look at Thomas Kennington's painting, Homeless, there is something of an allusion to that too, upon the streets. And it evokes sympathy too, but also there's something of anger in these images as well. They're not just sweet images. And it was the graphic magazine under William Lusson Thomas, who was himself a wood engraver, who produced this graphic magazine, that we get good insights into much of the evils of life in later Victorian England. And also the Illustrated London News, I would point out, is another great source of information for this. And of course, we have the greatest artists of the day illustrating, particularly Luke Fildes, who we've just looked at, and Frank Holl. There's one called "This is about sort of justice in a way," or the bobbies on the beat, and here they're taking a photograph of a ne'er do well there, and he's being held down by the bobbies. It's called "The Bashful Model" from 1873. Luke Fildes. And you can see there is a sense of playfulness about it too, a little bit of humour in it too, rather like Dickens. You have humour put against some of these most difficult of situations. We also see an arrest in a detail of William Powell Frith's painting of the railway station, and Frank Holl's wonderful painting here of Newgate committed for trial, 1878, is a great example of a social realist painting about the predicament of someone placed in prison. And Walter Crane, particularly a socially activist, a socialist, he does many an illustration railing against some of the evils that he observes in the streets of London of his age. And Luke Fildes does this wonderful illustration produced in the graphic "Homeless and Hungry," which forms the back. This group of figures are lining up for admission to the workhouse. And of course, that becomes his very well-known painting, which I'm just going to show you. Doré himself also paints the poorhouse in 1869, and these paintings are thought-provoking, and they were bought by some of the major benefactors of Victorian England to remind them of their duty towards the poor. And they were highly influential upon the young Vincent van Gogh when he came to London in 1873. Particularly the work of Fildes and Herkomer were an enormous influence upon the young Van Gogh. And this is the painting. This is Luke Fildes' painting, "Applicants for Admission to a Casual Ward," 1874. A sensational painting making its appearance at the Royal Academy of that year. And it is grim in the extreme, but again, the central figure of the woman cradling her baby is very, very similar to one of the other Victorian artists, Fred Walker's "The Lost Path," which is not just the lost path because of snow, but it is again this theme of the abandoned woman or the fallen woman in society, and having to seek relief within the poor house and admission to the casual ward. And what was it like inside the workhouse? Well, we know from artists like Herkomer, we have quite a good insight into what it was like in there. And this is a group of elderly women at the Westminster Union from 1878. And it follows on from Herkomer's illustrations in the graphic. There's one called "Charity," which is Christmas Day, and you can see the garlands hanging up in the workhouse. Notice all the women are without teeth, so they've got these sunken sort of mouths, and but they also are very often engaged in things like sewing or Bible reading or talking. And there seems to be on the wall a number of prints which would be elevating or seen as elevating from the owners of the warehouse of the workhouse. But G.F. Watts it makes his depiction of charity is not realistic in the sense that Herkomer's is. In fact, he's gone back a bit from his paintings of the Irish famine. Here, it's almost like a Madonna-like figure with these cherubs being clasped with under as by charity, a noble virtue. And we have also some quite nice genre paintings, which are realistic paintings of the Chelsea workhouse from 1877 by James Charles. And here we have a group of elderly women having a Bible reading within the Chelsea workhouse. It certainly looks a lot nicer than the male ward from the Illustrated London News, from another not so nice workhouse. Not that any of them were nice, but this one looks particularly evil. And also the low lodging houses as well, but depicted by Herkomer. We can see one above there, and we can see why these illustrations and paintings were very not just sort of touching, but we give us an insight into this this other side of life, rather like Dickens' novels do. They give us an insight into the life of the poor within Victorian England. And of course, nothing like it was the, as I've said, with the omnibus. It was also the railway that very much brought different classes together, and also provoked some great social realist observations. We know the quote from the Duke of Wellington that when talking to Queen Victoria in the 1840s, he said, "No good will come of it, ma'am. It will encourage the lower orders to travel to no purpose." He didn't like the idea that you know, the working class would be able to travel and get to different places, and he had great reservations about that. But yet Frith, in his painting The Railway Station, shows all human life, like rather like his Derby Day. We have everything from a bridal party to people going to school, to an arrest being made and other people boarding the train, and we get a great sense of Victorian life in all its fullness there. And Frith was a great observer of Victorian life. And of course, it was a great period of these railway trips, these long trips that could now be made, and then these paintings by George Earle of going north and going south, a sort of an update upon Frith's railway station 30 years later. But this really just depicts the wealthy going north or coming south. Because they're going to their grouse moors and their shooting parties, and it doesn't have quite the bite that the William Powell Frith has. But railway was a great subject for Victorian painters. Here we have Tissot's Waiting for the Train at Willesden Junction from 1871, and we get an idea of what it is like for a well-heeled Victorian on a train. Those who travelled abroad, Augustus Leopold Egg and his travelling companions depicts two young women in this beautiful painting here, but that's not cheek by jowl with the hoi polloi in this particular carriage. It's obviously a first class carriage, or the equivalent of it in Europe. We have this one, Waltz's painting, The Irritating Gentleman. I think many of us might know situations like that in trains, that we can be put off by a loud football supporter or somebody, and certainly people having unwanted conversations or being irritated by people. And of course, artists were quite interested and alive to these new situations which were coming about as a result of public transport. And also we have some wonderful illustrations too of these great engineering feats, particularly Baker Street Station on the Metropolitan Railway. And these illustrations, of course, if you go to Baker Street Station, it isn't look very much different from that today, except for the gauge of the tube track. And we have Abraham Solomon's painting of First Class Carriage meeting, and it's almost like the chaperone there. And it is a compartment where a meeting can take place, and so artists have been interested in this. And of course, these are delightful subjects for Victorians. They love the idea of the meeting in the railway carriage, and as we know, it's beloved of the film industry as well. And but these are early iterations of it, really, in painting. And then the great construction projects of the Victorian era. Benjamin Leader here in his painting of the Manchester Ship Canal from 1891. Very new type of painting, really. I mean, nobody 100 years before that would have depicted, even Joseph Wright would not have depicted a situation where you just had a construction project. But of course, these ally with some of the great things that were happening all over the British Empire, particularly we're thinking of the digging of the Suez Canal in 1869. And in a way, Poynter's painting of Israel in Egypt is also an oblique comment upon these new gigantic projects that were happening all across the world, and new railways and canals and construction projects that were happening. And so there is a correspondence between these ostensibly classical paintings and what was happening in the real world. And this is one of the most powerful paintings of the Victorian period, Hubert von Herkomer's Hard Times. and it is again like Watts. It is an Irish family, but this time in 1885, this labourer, although out of work and he has to travel with his family, he's not going to be beaten down by it. It shows a new, um, not necessarily optimism, but it shows that he is looking down a road and he's got the tools of his trade. And even though he is currently finding life difficult, he is not broken by it, and it's almost the worker as a hero. And this is something that appears in Herkomer's paintings and drawings of this period. They're very much on the side of the worker. And this is a powerful painting. We have the mother and child, like a Madonna type grouping there, almost a classical grouping. But the winding road obviously is very much symbolic of that there will be work around the corner, and as it takes place in spring, so summer will come and a change in circumstance. A remarkable piece of painting, Manchester City Art Gallery. Right. The rural poor. Well, Herkomer was good at that too, and Gathering Fuel, 1879, Life Slowing Fortunes, again depicting the rural poor. Hubert von Herkomer illustrates Tess of the D'Urbervilles in 1891, and we can see a scene from that. And many of the artists of the later part of the 19th century were influenced by Bastien Lepage, his paintings, Pour Fauvet, and some of his paintings, which have this unique blend of French Impressionism and photography and sentiment, were very popular upon a number of English artists, particularly artists like George Clawson as well. The Girl at the Gate is a very fine painting in this genre. It shows a great study of the face as well. It's different from the way Gainsborough approached the rural poor. There's something a little deeper about this situation, and obviously it has a thought-provoking intent about it, that there is almost a social awareness that things are on the change now, and we better take notice. And once again, Herkomer illustrates The Blind Basket Makers, 1871. An artist who I don't know much about, and until I was looking into background to this, is an artist, Edith Hume, who illustrates the life of women and women at work. And I'm sure it's worth of a study, actually. She's an illustrator as well, and this is about British work women. And also fisherfolk unloading their nets with children, a common subject actually in the late part of the 19th century. These fishing subjects were important because fishing is one of the hardest occupations known to us as a maritime nation, and yet somehow we sometimes take it for granted. But not in these paintings. They depict a world that is full of danger, and as we shall see. Eyre Crow's painting, The Dinner Hour at Wigan, from 1874, the same year as the Luke Fildes painting, is also a powerful painting, and it shows probably the result, really, of some of the new factory acts that allowing for working breaks and lunchtimes. Perhaps it has been said that this painting makes the sky seem a little bit too bright and everything looking a bit too cheerful. We don't have any of the sort of torn up clothes that we get in an old Luke Fildes painting, and we do get a sense that it's just a lunch hour, it's obviously a well-run factory. But how realistic it was, I can't say, but it certainly is an interesting piece of painting and social realism. But there was a harder side to life, and Hull again and Herkomer engaged with this, and particularly again Thomas Hood was in his poem "Song of the Shirt," which was highly influential as a song as well. And we have depictions of it. So Millet's Stitch, Stitch, Stitch from 1876 and Frank Hull's The Song of the Shirt give an idea of the life of young women who have to be seamstresses and often working with poor lighting conditions and threading needles and stitching away and working together. And then we look at Higbert Haircomer's Weary from 1879 of an elderly woman at a spinning wheel. And so we get an insight into some of the more menial occupations of later Victorian England. But Hall is always powerful in the way he paints, and deliciously so in his colour choices against the drabness of the background. We have just a little bit, obviously sewing finer garments for those of another class as well, which is a big issue about these particular paintings. There is Dickens himself, as depicted by Daniel Maclise. And in fact, Luke Fildes was engaged upon illustrating the serialization of The Mystery of Edwin Drood. And of course, then Dickens himself dies. But again, Fildes' illustrations to Dickens continued, and Fildes continued to make paintings based on the work of Charles Dickens, whom he knew well. And earlier pre-Raphaelite painting, Braithwaite Martineau, a friend and a follower of William Holman Hunt and Kit's writing lesson from 1852. Again, this Dickensian subject. Dickens is this towering figure who has a great influence upon artists. Dickens was actually a very early critic, a very severe critic of pre-Raphaelitism initially, but seems to later on, as the movement broadened and its scope widened, became very good friends with John Everett Millais, and certainly knew a number of these artists that I've talked about today. But he didn't see the full fruit of his influence dying in 1970, and so he would never have seen Homeless and Hungry. And yet his influence upon those paintings is enormous. And of course, Charles Kingsley too, and his book The Water Babies, and its sort of allegorical qualities, not only engaging with Charles Darwin's ideas on evolution, but also on the plight of the chimney sweep. And we have then Frederick Hardy's painting The Chimney Sweep up on the top right there, and a popular illustration of a chimney sweep. Again, a very dangerous and difficult occupation for mainly young boys under the age of 14, sent up chimneys. And again, it required acts of parliament to make that no longer to be legal. And one of the great social reformers was, of course, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury. And this painting by William Macduff, called Shaftesbury or Lost and Found from 1862, shows two chimney sweeps pointing to an image of Lord Shaftesbury in the window, and there are various images in the engraving shop window which illustrate the whole idea, and also the Christian morality behind change. So we have Christ accepting the little children, blessing them, as we can see in one of the engravings there. We can see Millais' order of release, where a Highlander is being welcomed back, a wounded Highlander is being welcomed back into the bosom of his family, and all the way through. And we see a painting by Landseer as well. So we see all these things illustrated, and Shaftesbury was an enormous influence upon this period, and we've touched upon him obviously in our talks before. But he was painted a few times by artists. But again, we have the sentimental side of social realism continued, and William Longsdale's painting of St Martin's, of a flower seller coming down from Covent Garden to sell blooms in a rather rainy London day outside St Martin in the Fields. Millais' A Waif here concentrate. Not necessarily, we look at the bare feet of the waif, but it's also a painting which evokes sympathy, and rather similar to the Gainsborough painting. But we get an insight into Victorian London, no doubt, in Longsdale's painting, because it is almost so photographic and the weather is so much in sympathy with the situation that this young woman, this young flower seller has, and the contrast between her and the rather more wealthy woman with the fur-lined coat and her daughter 3 or 4 paces behind is a good indication of the social commentary going on here. And Herkomer engages in 1891 with the idea of striking workers and workers standing up for their rights. And this particular painting, in 2 versions here, is a very powerful painting and something that is quite new. And it's again looks at the resolution upon the male protagonist's face. Rather like in Hard Times, it's similar to that. We remember that there was in this period there had been the match girls strike at Bryanton May. There's an illustration of it, and withdrawal of labour or union and the beginnings of organisation and union were obviously taking place at this time, and artists were now engaging with it, and absolutely artists such as William Morris and Walter Crane became part of the Socialist League, and so. And William Morris, of course, knew Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx, very well. And after the Linnell's death during a protest, Morris designed pamphlets to raise money. And he even wrote a poem as well, which was to raise money for Linnell's family. And there we have, again, Bloody Sunday from 1887, the Socialist League March, which was broken up by the police. And we can see here. And it's all fully illustrated. And there were some wonderful artistic banners at this time, too, using William Morris's illustrations depicting the famous dream of John Ball on this wonderful socialist banner on the right-hand side here. And in fact, there was a whole period of 10 years where Morris practically gave up visual art for social activism. And again, art always makes comments upon things. So here, John Tenniel in Sowing Tares, the socialist devil sows tares or weeds. It parodies Millet's popular parable illustration of the enemy sowing tares at night. And the worries that were beginning to arise in Victorian society about workers' organisation and the rise of socialism. And we have here also a Walter Crane illustration for and beautifully done. These early socialist illustrations, workers throughout the world uniting. So we have these beautiful illustrations for May Day. Emerging in the late part of the Victorian era. And how very much Watts's late paintings by G.F. Watts, here we have Industry and Greed and Mammon. And I think you can definitely see a link visually between these and the social realist art of the Soviet Union from the 1930s. There's definitely a direct correlation between this type of painting of the heroic worker and the background and the money, the mammon, the love of money and greed, this bestial figure in the middle, which is illustrated in a number of Watts's paintings. And Watts was very he dressed up his social activism in many ways in a sort of classical world. He was his own man. He was beholden to no one. But his paintings such as this break new ground and are powerful social critiques. And as indeed are these wonderful Heads of the People by Hubert von Herkomer. This Coast Guardsman from 1887 is almost the same year that Van Gogh was making a number of wonderful portrait heads of the workers in the fields in the south, near Arles in the south of France. And we know that Van Gogh admired Herkomer a great deal, and we can certainly see a lot of Herkomer's influence in Van Gogh's work. Of course, Van Gogh is an artist of supreme, importance in the history of art. Herkomer is not so well known, of course, but probably to this group pretty well known. But certainly these Heads of the People were new and really highly innovative for their dates. And we have these wonderful pictures of fishermen. And this one, a fish sale on the Cornish beach, is not just an excellent piece of sort of impressionism to some extent. It's also a wonderful study of a social situation of women with the fish on the shore, the weary sailors coming in, the people with the lobster pots in the back of it, the carts on the foreshore here, and the boats in the background. And these paintings are a new type of realism that was coming into English art through the Newlyn School and New English Art Club, which were two important groups in the latter part of the 19th century in England. And of course, the plight of the fishermen was ever on many a Victorian's mind. Atkinson Grimshaw's In Peril from 1879 shows the wildness of the sea and the flare of a beacon. Again, Frank Hull, a wonderful socialist realist painter, which I hope I've shown you a few of his good images tonight. No Tidings from the Sea from 1870. Again, the awful realization that the husband has been lost at sea, and they will naturally be condemned to sort of parish relief or destitution as a result of the fact of the drowning of the breadwinner. And of course, this is the theme of one of the greatest paintings from the Victorian era, Frank Bramley's A Hopeless Dawn, which really mirrors the words of the hymn, and for those in peril on the sea, or Eternal Father strong to save. And this painting is social realist, but it has certainly a religious quality to it. It is said that the table is rather like an altar. It has bread upon it and a jug, and it also has a candle flame. The sea in the background, the turbulent sea, is behind the window, and there's consolation too. As you can see, there is an open Bible upon just behind the mother, presumably the mother. A family Bible. The painting was influenced by John Ruskin's Harbours of England, and in that work, Ruskin affirmed that Christ is at the helm of every boat. So it is a religious painting, but it is a socially realistic painting. And A Hopeless Dawn was probably one of the most popular images of the later part of the 19th century in England. And again, like Fildes, its colour is quite drab, and it is unlike the dawn in the Luke Fildes Doctor. There is a lack here. The dawn light comes, but there's an emptiness about it too, and this enormous space which cannot be filled indicates the loss of the sailor at sea. I'd like to thank these particular galleries and the Creative Commons for some of the images today, particularly Christie's, Bonham's and Sotheby's, the Royal Holloway Picture Gallery, the Foundling Museum, indebted to them, and obviously the Victoria and Albert Museum as ever. So it's a big subject, many familiar faces, some maybe less so. I have a PDF of this talk if anybody's interested in it, so you can examine the images in more detail. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have about it right now.